This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Thank you for tuning in. We know what happened on Super Tuesday. Now you need to know why it happened, and nobody can do it better than NC Spin's panelists. Buckle up, because we're going to cover the White House down to the State House with expert analysis. And this week's panel includes Becki Gray, the Vice President of the John Locke Foundation, Patrick Sebastian, Political and Communications Consultant, Rick Henderson, Editor-in-Chief of the Carolina Journal, and Chris Fitzsimon, Director of State's Newsroom. We begin our uninterrupted debate after these brief messages from our underwriters.
In more than 21 years on NC Spin, I never endorsed a product or sponsor, but I volunteered to do this message for family physicians. Over the past 40 years, my family doctor could quickly diagnose my illnesses because he knew my medical history. Evidence suggests I'll live longer, have a higher quality of life, and save 33% on health care costs. I believe in my trusted relationship with my family physician.
Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Life's busy, but you're in control. As an electric cooperative member, you have access to lots of tools to help manage your home energy use and budget, so you can focus on what's most important.
Let's begin the spin. What a difference a week makes. On last week's show, our panel gave you their analysis of what to expect on Super Tuesday based on the polls, their contacts, and past experience. But none of us could have predicted the sudden and dramatic changes of this past week. We reported that 540,000 had cast their ballots in the first 15 days of early voting, but like a light switch being turned on, another 253,000 cast ballots on the last 2 days, and by the end of early voting, 2,100 people, or 2,100,000 people, or 31% of the registered voters had cast ballots. So we want our panel to help us understand what happened and why. Becki, early voting exceeded 2016 levels, but overall voting was a bit below our average of 37 to 40%. Why?
Well, it was. I wouldn't make too much about it. I mean, it was a small percentage. It may have been, as we've seen in some other states, voting among Democrats was lower. Also, the Republican ballot was not as interesting, and so maybe people stayed home. Could be that a lot of Republicans and Democrats know they're going to vote for whoever the Republican or Democrat candidate is, no matter what the primary would determine. I wouldn't make too much about it. I think moving forward, I think in November we can expect record turnout. Trump will drive all of that. People will either come out to vote for Trump or they'll come out to vote against Trump, but they're going to come out to vote.
But Chris, last Friday, we went through what the pollsters were saying. Mm-hmm. We had this beautiful graphic with all of the recent polls and so forth like that. And then Saturday happened, and right. South Carolina's Congressman Jim Clyburn endorsed Joe Biden. The earth shifted because on Sunday, two other candidates pulled out of the race. And by Monday, the world had changed, had it not?
Well, it had. That was one of the most remarkable 72 or 96 hours in national politics in a long time. And I heard one analyst put it pretty well, which is the Democrats, in her minds, came to their senses and realized that this is not an election year for them to take a chance, that their opposition and animosity toward President Trump is so deep that they weren't willing to give even Elizabeth Warren a chance. They were scared of Bernie Sanders, even though a lot of people might agree with his issues, and that the electability became the fundamental issue. And a lot of African-American community trusts Joe Biden. They know him. That was his slogan, really, that Joe Biden knows us. That's what Congressman Clyburn says. And that really became the driving force, and the momentum swept across the country, not just in North Carolina.
We didn't anticipate. I mean, we expected the African-American community was going to back Biden, but there was a groundswell of black voters showing up. Even with the 31%, there was still a groundswell of black voters that showed up.
I mean, the thing that was really interesting to me was I wanted to see what the early voting numbers showed when the State Board of Elections first started posting results, because they do that before they get the counties to come in and report Election Day balloting. And at that time, Biden had about a 7-point lead over Bernie Sanders, and Mike Bloomberg was at about 18, and Elizabeth Warren was about 14. And as the actual election day numbers came in, Biden just blew people out. And
20%.
Yeah, 20%. And this was actually reflected in some tracking polls Civitas was doing, where they said the last 10 days of the election, Biden did a 20-point turnaround in that period. And so it was just dramatic.
Ray Northstein wrote a good piece about this on the Civitas website, in which he was saying their tracking was the most accurate of anybody's. Patrick, we talked about Biden's 20% victory. How much of that was because Democratic voters were worried about Sanders and the impact he would have come November?
Well, I think a couple things. One, the ECU poll may have been the closest poll, our alma mater, but I want to say, first of all, that I think a lot of people thought Bloomberg could win this race because of all the money he put on television. But we see nowadays, TV does not have the power that it once had. He put over $15 million on television in North Carolina. But you know what? Not everyone's watching TV. They're cutting the cord. They're DVRing their shows and not watching ads, and digital advertising is
It wasn't just advertising, though.
Yeah.
He had the endorsement of a former governor who happens to be a panelist on our show from time to time. The leaders of the state Democratic legislative leadership.
Two biggest cities.
Lots of really big name Democrats in North Carolina, and he didn't hardly scratch.
I think what happened was it was really after the Nevada primary going into South Carolina. I think there was just a complete panic that occurred on the Democratic side, was that, whoa, you mean Bernie really could be the candidate? If our goal is to beat President Trump, we're going to have to do something. Biden went up 24 points in 11 days.
It's also important, especially in states like Virginia. We'll see if the analysis is true in North Carolina, but in Virginia, there was a lot of analysis done. Biden not only got the African-American vote, he got the suburban white women, which are really important as we move toward the general election.
And Patrick, the millennials did not show up that much.
They didn't, and remember, we're a rapidly growing state. Our turnout, or the Democratic Party turnout, was much lower than the 2008 turnout. Not just the rate, but the actual number of people.
Well,
that's something that Democrats need to worry about.
It tells you a couple of things, though. First of all, it tells you that President Obama was an incredible draw for millennial voters, for voters of all sorts of different demographic categories who normally don't vote. And that was Bernie Sanders' strategy. We're going to get people who normally don't vote and not appeal to people who normally do vote. And that's Joe Biden's base right there.
Even as we're taping this show, they're still doing a post-mortem on Super Tuesday. But we're
doing the mortem. They're doing the post-mortem.
Touche. A lot of what we're hearing about this was that white women, moderates, and middle-aged people voted. Millennials did not turn out as much. African Americans voted, and that's what we saw. And that's part of what carried that 20%. Let's go down to the U.S. Senate race, because I don't know that anybody was particularly surprised by that outcome. Thom Tillis won. However, he only got 78% of the vote, Becki. Does that tell you anything?
Well, and 3 primary challengers that he had.
But I mean,
yeah, it does tell you a little bit something that, Republicans are not 100%. They're 74%, if you will, in favor of Thom Tillis. And I think that's something that he needs to pay attention to. I don't think it comes as a surprise to him. But going into the general election, I'm 95% sure that most Republicans are going to back Thom Tillis rather than Cal Cunningham.
Yeah, well, we'll have
now that we're past the primary.
Yes. Well, there were a number of Republicans who were unaffiliated, typically really Republicans, but they were unaffiliated voters. They were being urged to go to the polls and vote for Erica Smith, Patrick.
Yeah, I think it was probably a small amount of number. They tried to do that in South Carolina too.
It was.
But you know what? What I think the big story is that it took over $15 million to drag Cal Cunningham across the finish line. $15 million. And, I know the Republicans put a few $1 million behind Erica Smith, but that's a heck of a lot of money to get about 57%
I'm not calling
of the vote.
57% dragging across the finish line.
He's the chosen candidate,
plus a few $1 million by a Republican group. I got 3 robocalls and 3 mailers at my house. I'm an unaffiliated voter on behalf of Erica Smith. So they spent a lot of money trying to make it harder for Cal Cunningham.
Is this going to be the most expensive Senate race in the country this time?
I'm guessing so, because the only other one that I can think that's going to be as close is Colorado, and there are not as many people in Colorado.
Maybe Arizona.
Possibly.
I'm hearing estimates of $150 to $200 million will go into this Senate race. And and that would be probably the most expensive in the country.
Well, while the news media focused primarily on the presidential primary, there were some interesting down-ballot races. Time doesn't permit us to list each one of the winners, but we do want to highlight some that we found interesting. And the gubernatorial primaries turned out pretty much as expected, with Cooper and Forrest winning their nominations, but the lieutenant governor races were interesting. Let's begin with the Republicans, Patrick. There were 9 candidates running, including some pretty well-known names, like former Congressman Renee Elder, Superintendent of Public Instruction Mark Johnson, Scott Stone from Charlotte, and Senator Andy Wells from Hickory. The nomination went to a newcomer, Mark Robinson. Nobody had ever heard of him before.
I have to tell you, I'm not sure why people are so surprised over that. He made quite a showing in the Greensboro City Council a couple years ago when he went in front of a very liberal group and started talking about gun rights in a booming voice, a booming speech. He is a very well-spoken...
It went viral on the internet.
He went viral. He's a very well-spoken, very forceful speaker. He's African-American, Republican male. You don't see that often in high-level politics. And people really latched on to him. And another thing about that, too, though, a lot of people think these state representatives are going to be the front runners in a race when they get in. But you know what? Outside their own districts, people really don't know who they are. And I know that surprises them.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
On that Mark Robinson, I think that's a good example of social media influence in a race. I mean, as Patrick mentioned, there was a viral video, YouTube video. We're in real disruptive times, and we will continue to talk about the amount of money that is spent going on TV with mailers and those kind of things.
And he was
I think the influence of social media is really the disruptive thing here.
It reminds me a little bit of Mark Walker's initial race in the 6th district, where he was sort of behind the scenes. He didn't do an awful lot of paid media, but when you drove through that district, there were Mark Walker signs everywhere, and he upset winner in that primary.
I think there's some nervousness at the Republican Party headquarters about when we start looking into Mark Robinson. It's not clear what job he holds. His website talks about public schools are trying to indoctrinate our students. He doesn't seem like a supporter of public education. I think once people start vetting him in the general election, I'm not sure that this is the candidate the Republicans want on the ballot as we go forward.
Let's move over to the Democratic side, Chris, because, again, we had 6 candidates there. We had some representatives, State Senator Terry Van Dyne, Yvonne Lewis Holley from Raleigh, who's a state representative, ended up by winning the majority of vote there. She got 26% of the vote. Terry Van Dyne came in at 20.4. Van Dyne had outspent Yvonne dramatically. I mean, it was like $519,000 to $78,000. What happened?
Well, I don't know what happened, but I know that, for example, the Durham Committee on the Affairs of Black People endorsed Yvonne Holley, which is a big deal in the Triangle. She got a big African-American vote that people knew who she was. The surprise sort of was, and we talked about this last week, Chaz Beasley, an African-American state legislator from Charlotte, another urban area. I think a very smart guy. I think a lot of people thought if there was a runoff, it would be between Van Dyne and Chaz Beasley, not between Van Dyne and Yvonne Holley. The interesting thing, I think Van Dyne has until March 12th to call for a runoff in that race. That's one of the things that is still unsettled from the election. There's a lot of pressure for her not to call for a runoff, and we'll see what happens.
All the other candidates have said they don't think there ought to be a runoff, and they've thrown their support behind Yvonne.
Yeah.
If you're Terry, what are the decision points for you in trying to make a decision whether to call a runoff?
She's really got to look and see how she did statewide, outside of Buncombe County, because this is to reinforce Patrick's point. Terry Van Dyne is somebody who was really well known on Jones Street and somebody really well known in her district, but not very well known outside of it. And so
she was on television.
In the Triangle, she was. And I don't know if she was statewide, but here's the thing. I mean, Yvonne Lewis Holley very smartly spent a lot of money on African-American radio stations.
Exactly.
She knew where the voters were.
And had the network in the African-American community.
Exactly. She did really well there.
Let's move to the Attorney General's race, Rick. Prior to the election night, it was a pretty bitter, ugly race there. It was getting really hot. But Forsyth DA Jim O'Neill won fairly handily over Sam Hayes and Chris Mumma. Explain that one.
O'Neill ran in 2016 for Attorney General in the Republican primary and lost to Buck Newton, who did not prevail, who lost to Josh Stein in the general. But he's run a statewide race before, and that's really important. I mean, you can't really downplay how important it is to go out and meet voters and run a statewide race and run a credible statewide race. And I think that was a big help to him. I think with Chris Mumma, she was a little. I thought she was a strong candidate in a lot of ways, and it sort of her finish surprised me. But then again, she came across, even though she was involved, she's head of the Actual Innocence Project and involved with criminal justice reform. She talked an awful lot about illegal immigrants and supporting Donald Trump and things like that, and that may not have been a very consonant message there.
Let's move over to the superintendent of public instruction race. Over on the Republican side, Catherine Truitt bested longtime House Education Chair Craig Horn. Surprised at that?
You know, I was a little bit. And of course, Catherine Truitt was Governor McCrory's education advisor when he was the governor. She now is in charge of runs the Western Governors School. I was a little bit surprised at that. Two, I think, really strong candidates on the Republican side. I've kind of asked around about it and was told that her campaign was a little more organized within the Republican circles for that primary. I was surprised at that. Two strong candidates, and you know, this is where we're going to be. And because education is such a huge issue in North Carolina, tremendously important.
Chris, were you surprised at the Democratic race for superintendent of public instruction? Dr. Jen Mangrum won pretty handily.
Yeah, I think
there.
a little bit. Although she ran a fairly strong campaign against Senator Berger, was sort of which got her into the Democratic mainstream. One thing to think about in all these races is two things are very unusual. One is the primary was insanely early, so a lot of these statewide campaigns didn't have the time or the money to go around statewide. Secondly, we were flooded. I don't watch that much TV, and every time I turned it on, I saw a Mike Bloomberg ad. There was not a lot of air room and airspace, and Trump and Bloomberg and Biden and Bernie. That's all everybody was talking about. It was even harder than usual in a shorter time frame than usual, which is why they're so unpredictable.
To the Commissioner of Labor's race, Patrick, and Republican Josh Dobson of Nebo beat out Pearl Boris Floyd, who is relatively well known statewide, and Chuck Stanley. Were you surprised at that?
I thought Pearl would do a little bit better than she did. So that was a little bit surprising, you know, but I'm starting to think on these down ballot race, it is kind of a crapshoot, frankly. There's only so much money. If you have $500,000 for a down ballot race, that does not go very far.
And so far as the treasurer's race, of course, Dale Falwell's got the Republican nomination, but on the Democratic side, there was a three-way race there. Ronnie Chatterjee came out the victor of it. Were you surprised?
What it told me was that Wake County really delivered, because Chatterjee's statewide margin of victory was 20,000. He won Wake County by 26,000.
Yeah. Well, all 13 congressional districts were up for election on Tuesday night. Becki, in the first district, we had Sandy Smith from Winterville, who won against G.K. Butterfield, won to run against G.K. Butterfield. That's a Democratic district.
Well, you know, yeah, it is, but given certain circumstances, Sandy Smith was well funded. She tied herself to President Trump. And yeah, we'll see what happens there.
All right, so in the second district, Deborah Ross won the Democratic nomination there, and George Holden's seat, everybody sort of expected that to be the case. Let's move over to the sixth. The Democratic primary there, Kathy Manning from Greensboro, bested four others, including former Representative Ed Haynes. Some people were surprised at that. Joseph Haywood won the Republican nominations. Any surprises there to you?
You know, she ran against Ted Budd a couple of years ago. I think that gave her quite a platform to be the chosen one this time. That one really didn't surprise me much. She had a lot of money.
Well funded.
Yeah, let's move to the 11th district, because that's really one of the more interesting elections of the entire cycle as far as it goes. There may be one statewide runoff, but there's probably going to be one in this 11th district. This is Mark Meadows' seat that he's vacating. We had 12 Republicans running there. Linda Bennett of Maggie Valley got 23% of the vote. Madison Cawthorn of Hendersonville got 20%. Any insights as to what happened there?
The front runner there was endorsed by Donald Trump, was endorsed by a lot of other folks, and she still wasn't able to go across the finish line, but she had 12 candidates.
Surprised with Senator Davis, I thought. I think a lot of us thought incumbent Senator Jim Davis would have done better.
Came in a close third with that, but that is a mess up there. Those Republicans up there in the western part of the state are fighting over everything. The way that Mark Meadows gave up that seat and made his announcement was very controversial.
Serious up there.
But that young man that's running, 24 years old, in a wheelchair, was in a terrible automobile accident. So really interesting dynamics there.
Let's move to some legislative races. I think we're going to have Mo Davis, by the way, won that Democratic race
from Asheville, which
from
is
Asheville.
now part of that
Strong Republican district.
Yeah.
Well, it's not as strong, nearly as strong as it was. It's actually more Democratic than it was.
All right. Let's move to some of the legislative races, because I do want us to hit those. And I want to thank NC Free and our panelist, Anna Bevan Gravely, who closely tracks all of this and helped us with information. I want to highlight a few of the seats so far as that was concerned. Rick, there were a couple of upsets from incumbents. Five-term incumbent Elmer Floyd from Fayetteville was turned out by Kimberly Hardy.
Right.
Why?
The redistricting did that. Elmer Floyd was perceived by a lot of people to be too business friendly. There was a C4 group running ads on behalf of Elmer Floyd on television locally, and I couldn't believe it.
Didn't hurt that he'd voted for HB2 and also for
the budget.
For the,
We're in a
GOP.
polarized world right now. Just one vote against your party can do you in.
In Senate 29, Eddie Gallimore, Senator Eddie Gallimore from Davidson, spent $10,000 and was beaten by Representative Steve Jarvis, who spent $49,000. Surprise?
I was surprised. I think the surprise was when Steve Jarvis decided to challenge the first-year incumbent Eddie Gallimore in that.
All right. In Senate District 11, former Rick Horner's seat that was redistricted, former Senator Alan Wellens from Smithfield won the Democratic nomination, and Lisa Stone Barnes won the GOP nomination there over Commissioner Patrick Harris and Dennis Nielsen. Comments on that?
A heck of a lot of money was put behind Lisa Barnes, including by the Chamber of Commerce, and I think she's going to be the front runner in the fall.
Let's move over to House 82. This was Linda Johnson's seat. She has just recently died. And Republican Kristen Baker, who's a psychiatrist, and God knows the legislature could use some of them, will face Amy Steele, who's an educator. Handicap that. Anybody?
I think that Kristen Baker will be appointed for the replacement for Linda Johnson for the rest of this session. She gets to run as an incumbent. That district loved Linda Johnson. I think they're looking for a replacement. Kristen Baker even looks like Linda Johnson.
All right, so we have to bring up, even though it was not the climax and the excitement that we normally have, but we would not be doing justice to these races if we didn't talk about House District 119. With Joe Sam Queen and Mike Clampett.
You can just pencil this in every year.
Hatfield versus McCoy, right?
Yeah, they just take turns. We don't even have an election.
All right, let's go to Senate 18, the former Johnny Mac Alexander seat. It was the third most affected by redistricting. Sarah Crawford spent $137,000 and won over Angelin Bridgman. And for the GOP, Larry Norman's going to run in that race.
It's been redistricted to be a fairly safe Democratic district.
It should be.
And she ran a decent campaign when it was a Republican district.
And we got to talk about Senate 49, which is Terry Van Dyne's seat. Julie Mayfield won a three-person race there on the Democratic side, and that's basically around Asheville area, to run against Bob Penland, Republican. Any surprise in that?
I think the winner was on the ground more. It's a very liberal seat. Hit the most doors.
All right, so there's several others that I think we want to try to bring up here. House 9 district was the Farkas race with Perrin Jones.
As a Republican.
Yes.
Perrin Jones is right now the only physician in the House. Incumbent, he took Greg Murphy's seat when Greg ran for that congressional seat. I think he's a strong candidate. I think he's well funded. I know that's kind of a toss-up district, but I think that he'll do quite well.
And you did some consulting in that
Perrin
race.
is my client. Put it out there. I think that race is going to be a lot on the last state budget, in which Representative Jones voted for the budget, which included the Brody School of Medicine. You had Brian Farkas say he would have voted against the budget if he was in the General Assembly. That's going to be a real touchstone.
We were watching the House 102 Becki Carney seat because she had some pretty stiff competition.
Yep, long-time, well-beloved member of the General Assembly. I think she had 3 primary challenges. Sailed through it, but there was some talk of she might be in trouble.
A couple of questions I want to wrap up this show with. Number one, early voting. I was one of those, and we've done this for years, who went to the polls and voted early. And, Lord, the world changed by the time the election day came around, and I'm just wondering, did we have too long a period for early voting? Should we continue early voting? Comments?
I think we're going to continue it because people like it, but there's a risk associated with it.
Yeah.
It's too long. It's too long because, like you said, the Earth can change in just a day, and you want to wait as long as you can to cast your ballot. But that's a lot of people regretted what they did and they voted early. Another thing, I went and tried to vote early in Raleigh the week before. It was an hour wait.
Really?
I left. I came back on election day, 1 minute wait.
Really?
Yeah, I think that's a good point because we're not going to do anything to change early voting because it's impossible to do so. I think at this point people are used to it, but there really now is a calculated risk in voting early.
A lawsuit that's been started on absentee ballot voting because they're saying some of the changes that we made weren't particularly good.
Well, I don't know about that. I was going to come into early voting. We'll always have early voting. It's really insane that we ask people to sometimes take off 2 or 3 hours of work and wait in line. And
so
vote.
here we are.
The question is, how much do we need? We went from, I think, 10 days to 17 days.
Here we are in the middle of March. We have decided our primary elections. These candidates have got to wait from now till November 3rd.
But we counted this time. Had our primary been in May, it would have been between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. And so at least we had a way to vote way in here.
Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, sign up for our free weekly email newsletter. Give your feedback and read my weekly column. Visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. While there, subscribe to our podcast, also our YouTube channel. And join us next week when we'll have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
In more than 21 years on NC Spin, I never endorsed a product or sponsor, but I volunteered to do this message for family physicians. Over the past 40 years, my family doctor could quickly diagnose my illnesses because he knew my medical history. Evidence suggests I'll live longer, have a higher quality of life, and save 33% on health care costs. I believe in my trusted relationship with my family physician.
Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Life's busy, but you're in control. As an electric cooperative member, you have access to lots of tools to help manage your home energy use and budget, so you can focus on what's most important.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC TV network.